The silence of the hall after a rehearsal is never truly silent. It hums with the ghost of the crescendo, settling into the velvet seats and the heavy drapes. But tonight, the silence was broken by a single, persistent line of melody. I stood in the wings, hidden by the heavy stage curtain, watching the dust motes dance in the single ghost light. On center stage, Charlotte sat alone. She was playing the same 4 bars of Mahler, over and over. The scent of rosin and old wood drifted toward me, sharp and familiar. My hand, resting on the velvet rope, trembled slightly. Not from the fatigue of a 12-hour day, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that I couldn't look away. The professional distance I had curated for 20 years was evaporating in the dim light, leaving me exposed. This premiere was supposed to be my coronation, Mahler's 5th Symphony, the kind of beast that either cements a conductor's legacy or exposes her as a fraud. For months, I had treated the score like a blueprint. Music, to me, is architecture. It is structure, load-bearing walls of brass, soaring arches of strings, and the precise calculation of tension and release. I don't believe in happy accidents. I believe in control. Absolute, unyielding precision. That is how I survived in a world designed for men in tails. I built my reputation on the podium with a baton that moved like a scalpel, excising emotion until only the pure, crystalline sound remained. But Charlotte, she was the anomaly in my carefully constructed machine. As the first violinist, she was the leader of the string section, the nervous system of the orchestra. Technically, she was flawless. Her intonation was terrifyingly perfect. Her bowing arm, a study in physics. But she played with a guard up, a wall of glass that kept the music, and me, at a distance. She was a mirror, reflecting my own rigidity right back at me, and I hated it.
Earlier that morning, the rehearsal had felt like wading through wet concrete. The orchestra is a single organism, a 1,000-headed beast that breathes when I breathe. But Charlotte stood apart. When I demanded a ritardando, a slowing of the pulse, she held the tempo with a stubbornness that bordered on mutiny. It wasn't incompetence. It was refusal. She refused to let the phrase bleed. She kept it clean, sterile, safe.
The Adagietto is not safe. It is a love letter, written in blood and deep, unending grief. It requires a vulnerability that strips you bare before 2,000 strangers. You cannot play it with a wall up. You have to let it break you. Watching her from the podium that morning, under the searing heat of the stage lights, I felt the sweat trickling down my back. My shoulders burned with the physical toll of conducting, the sheer athletic effort of holding the sound together. But looking at her, I didn't feel the music. I felt a challenge. Her eyes had met mine over the music stand, cool and assessing. She wasn't following me. She was waiting for me. Waiting for me to finally drop the facade, to stop conducting the notes and start conducting the ache between them. It absolutely infuriated me. I am the general music director. I am the authority. The podium elevates me 3 feet above the floor for a reason. It is a position of command. Yet, looking at the curve of her neck as she tucked the violin closer, I felt that authority slipping. Now, watching her alone on the stage, the frustration curdled into something heavier, denser. The air around me felt charged, thick with the unspoken friction that had been building between us for weeks. It wasn't just about the tempo, it was about the surrender. She played the phrase again, the high F sharp hanging in the air, pure but hollow. It lacked the grain, the grit of real longing. She was afraid of it, just as I was afraid of what it would mean to demand it from her. I adjusted the cuffs of my shirt, feeling the silk stick to my skin. I could leave. I could walk out the stage door, get into my car, and drive home to the silence of my empty, pristine apartment. I could leave her to her practice. But the architecture of the symphony was failing. The foundation was cracking under the weight of our mutual restraint. If we didn't fix this, the premiere would be a hollow shell, a technical marvel with no heart.
I needed to break her composure. I needed to shatter that glass wall and see what lay beneath. It was a professional necessity, I told myself, a requirement of the job. But as I stepped out from the shadows of the wings, the sharp click of my heels echoing in the vast, empty cavern of the hall, I knew it was a lie. I wasn't stepping out to fix the violin section. I was stepping out because the pull was undeniable. I needed to be close enough to actually hear her breathe. I needed to see if I could make her hands shake the way mine were shaking now. Charlotte didn't startle when I spoke. She simply lowered the bow, the horsehair hovering an inch above the string, and turned her head. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted down by the dust and the history of the room. "You're dragging the phrase," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. I didn't step onto the podium. I stayed on the floor, looking up at her. It was a calculated choice. I wanted to see the angle of her chin, the tension in her jaw. "You're treating the adagietto like it's a lullaby. It isn't. It's a confession." Charlotte adjusted her grip on the neck of the violin. Her eyes were dark, unreadable in the shadows cast by the ghostlight. "I'm playing exactly what's on the page, maestro. The tempo marking is sehr langsam, very slow." "The page is ink," I snapped, the exhaustion finally fraying the edges of my patience. "The music is what happens when you stop reading and start feeling. You're playing it safe, Charlotte. It's clean. It's pristine. And it is utterly boring." I walked around the edge of the stage, the wood creaking softly under my feet. I needed to be closer. I needed to see the specific mechanics of her resistance. I climbed the stairs to the stage left, the change in elevation shifting the dynamic instantly. Now I was in her space. The smell of her, a mix of expensive rosin, French laundry soap, and the metallic tang of adrenaline, was sharper here. "Play the transition to the C-sharp minor," I commanded, leaning against the grand piano that had been pushed to the side. "And this time, don't glide over the shift. I want to hear the friction. I want to hear the struggle of the note trying to exist." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she lifted the violin. The instrument was an extension of her body, a seamless graft of maple and spruce to bone and sinew. She played. And again, it was technically perfect. The intonation was diamond sharp, the bowing was smooth as oil on water. "Stop," I said, louder this time. She froze. "You are smoothing out the edges," I said, stepping closer until I was just outside the range of her bow arm. "You are afraid of the grit. Why?" Charlotte lowered the instrument slowly. She turned fully toward me, and for the first time, I saw the crack in her composure. It wasn't submission. It was defiance.
"I am playing with precision," she said, her voice low, matching the hum of the room. "Precision is what you demand. You stop the rehearsal if the oboe is a microtone flat. You scream at the brass if the attack isn't unified to the millisecond. You built this entire orchestra on the concept of absolute control." She took a step toward me, closing the distance. "Don't pretend you want messiness now, just because the piece is romantic."
"I don't want messiness," I countered, holding her gaze. "I want truth. There is a difference." "Is there?" She tilted her head, a stray lock of dark hair falling over her eyes. She didn't brush it away. "Or are you just terrified that if we play this with real heat, the structure you built won't hold it?" The question hung in the air between us, vibrating like a plucked string. It was an accusation, but it was delivered with a strange, sultry softness. She wasn't just challenging my musical interpretation. She was challenging my capacity to feel. She was looking at me not as a subordinate looks at a boss, but as a woman looks at a puzzle she has almost solved. Then the rain began. It started as a whisper against the high copper roof of the concert hall, a distant static that quickly swelled into a dull roar. The sound sealed us in. The outside world, the board members, the critics, the traffic, the expectations, washed away, leaving only the vast, cavernous dark of the hall and the two of us, standing in the pool of dim light. The atmosphere shifted, the air pressure dropping, making the space between us feel dense, almost swimmable. "You think I'm afraid of the heat?" I asked, my voice dropping to match the intimacy of the storm. "I think you conduct like you're holding back a flood," Charlotte said. She wasn't backing down. Her chest rose and fell, the breath catching slightly in her throat. You want me to roughen the edges? Fine, but you have to let me. You can't micromanage the passion. You have to let it break something. I looked at her hands. They were strong, capable hands, the fingertips calloused from years of pressing steel strings against ebony. And in that moment, watching the way her thumb rested against the frog of the bow, I realized I had misread her completely. She wasn't stubborn. She wasn't refusing to play with emotion because she was cold. She was refusing because she was terrified. She was holding back the flood just as tightly as I was, because she knew that once she let go, she wouldn't be able to stop. She was a mirror. She was reflecting my own terror right back at me. And the recognition of it was a physical blow. Then break it, I whispered, the command sounding more like a plea. Break it, Charlotte. Show me what happens when you stop being perfect.
3 days later, the pressure in the hall was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on our shoulders. The board of directors had been sitting in on rehearsals, a row of silent, judging silhouettes in the balcony. Every mistake felt amplified. Every missed entrance, a potential career-ending catastrophe. I could feel the tension radiating off the orchestra, a brittle, snapping energy that made the air taste metallic. I was exhausted. My temper was short, my instructions clipped and harsh. I was driving them hard, trying to force the cohesion that still felt just out of reach.
During the mid-morning break, the musicians scattered like marbles, desperate for coffee or a moment of silence. I stayed on the podium for a moment, reorganizing my score, trying to slow my heart rate. When I finally stepped down, intending to retreat to my office, I saw her. Charlotte hadn't left. She was sitting on a stool near the basses, her violin resting on her lap. She was frowning, turning the instrument over in her hands with a look of intense concentration. I should have kept walking. I should have maintained the barrier. But the pull was automatic, magnetic. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the carpeted aisle. Is something wrong with the instrument? I asked. She looked up, startled, but didn't scramble to stand. That was another thing about Charlotte. She didn't perform deference. The bridge shifted slightly. I think the humidity is getting to the wood. It sounds muffled. Let me see. It wasn't a request. I stepped into her personal space, crossing the invisible line that usually separates conductor from musician. I stood close enough that I could smell the faint, clean scent of her, something like cedar and rain, distinct from the stale air of the hall. She held the violin out to me, but she didn't let go. For a moment, we were both holding it, the fragile wooden body suspended between us. It was a granary, darker and deeper than a Stradivarius, with a temperamental soul. I ran my thumb along the curve of the F-hole, checking the grain. My hand brushed hers. It was a fleeting contact, accidental, but the shock of it traveled up my arm like a static discharge. Her skin was warm, shockingly warm, against the cool varnish of the instrument. Hold it steady, I murmured, leaning in closer to inspect the feet of the bridge. I was so close now that I could see the tiny flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I could hear the shallow intake of her breath. The proximity was dizzying. In the rehearsal, she was a distant figure, a part of the collective sound. Here, she was jarringly real. The heat radiating from her neck, the way a single pulse point beat steadily at the base of her throat. It was overwhelming. The angle is off by a millimeter, I said, my voice dropping to a hush. I didn't pull back. Here, I reached out, placing my hands over hers to adjust the bridge. It was an intimate gesture, far more intimate than I had intended. My fingers covered hers, guiding the pressure. I could feel the strength in her hands, the latent power of the musician. But I also felt a tremor, a slight, almost imperceptible vibration that wasn't coming from the strings. You're tense, I observed, looking up. Our faces were inches apart. You make me nervous, Charlotte admitted. Her voice was low, sultry, stripped of the usual professional veneer. She wasn't looking at the violin. She was looking at my mouth. The air between us thickened, charging with a sudden, heavy silence. It wasn't the silence of an empty hall. It was the silence of a held breath. The dust motes seemed to stop dancing. The world narrowed down to the warmth of her hands under mine, the smell of wood varnish, and the undeniable, terrifying realization that she felt it too. This wasn't just about the music. It was about the friction of two bodies occupying the same gravitational field. "I'm not trying to make you nervous," I said, and the lie tasted sweet on my tongue. "I'm trying to make you better." "Maybe they're the same thing," she whispered. For a second, time suspended. I could have leaned in. The impulse was there, a wild, reckless urge to close the final inch of distance, to see if the taste of her matched the heat. But then the bell rang. The sharp, jarring sound of the rehearsal bell cut through the moment like a knife. We both flinched.
I pulled my hands away, the loss of contact leaving my skin feeling cold. Charlotte adjusted her grip on the violin, her mask sliding back into place, but her eyes remained dark, dilated. The dynamic had shifted. We weren't just conductor and concertmaster anymore. We were conspirators in a secret that hadn't even been spoken aloud yet. As I walked back to the podium, my legs felt unsteady. The bridge was fixed, but something else had come undone. By Wednesday, the air in the hall was so thick with humidity and accumulated exhaustion that it felt less like a concert venue and more like a pressure cooker waiting for a valve to blow. The weather had turned, a heavy, relentless rain hammering against the roof, and the sound inside the auditorium had turned to sludge. The acoustics, usually my greatest ally, had betrayed me. The notes weren't soaring, they were sinking, heavy and waterlogged, dying before they even reached the balcony.
We were working on the scherzo, a movement that requires absolute crystalline clarity. It is a waltz, but a twisted one, full of irony and bite. It needs to sound sharp, dangerous. Instead, it sounded tired. The woodwinds were pushing sharp, fighting the humidity, while the brass section was dragging behind the beat like they were wading through waist-deep water. Every time I brought the baton down, I felt the resistance, a sluggish, heavy pull that made my arms ache. "Stop," I said, tapping the music stand. They stopped. The silence was ragged, filled with the shifting of feet and the clearing of throats. "The horns," I said, my voice tight, clipped. "You are late. Again. This is not a dirge. It is a waltz. You are dancing, not marching to a funeral." We started again, measure 108. And again, the drag, the heavy, suffocating weight of sound refusing to lift. I didn't tap the stand this time. I slammed the baton down against the metal rim with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The sound was violent, shocking in the refined air of the hall. The Ice Queen, the nickname they thought I didn't know, the persona I'd carefully cultivated for 2 decades, didn't just crack. She shattered. "Profound incompetence is not a stylistic choice," I shouted, the anger tearing out of my throat, raw and ugly. "If you cannot follow a simple beat, perhaps you should consider a career in a marching band where the rhythm is dictated by your feet, not your brain." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that sucks the air out of a room. Musicians looked down at their shoes, at their scores, anywhere but at me. They had seen me cold. They had seen me exacting. They had never seen me lose control. But Charlotte, she didn't look down.
I turned my gaze to the first chair, desperate for a target, desperate to focus this free-floating panic that was masquerading as rage. Charlotte sat perfectly still, her bow resting on her knee. She was watching me. Her expression wasn't fearful. It wasn't even judgmental. It was an intense, studying gaze, dark and unreadable. She looked at me like she was dissecting a complex chord, isolating the dissonance. She saw the tremor in my hand. She saw the sweat on my temple. She saw through the anger to the terror underneath. And that visibility was unbearable.
"And you," I snapped, wheeling on her, "you are rushing the downbeat. You are pulling the entire string section forward because you refuse to settle into the pocket." It was a lie. A blatant, unfair lie. Charlotte had been the only thing holding the tempo together. She was the anchor. But I needed to break her. I needed to make her stop looking at me with that knowing, sultry calm. "I am following your stick, maestro," Charlotte said. Her voice was calm, projecting effortlessly to the podium. If I am rushing, it is because you are accelerating. The orchestra stopped breathing. No one spoke back to me. Not like that. Not in front of everyone. Do not correct me, I hissed, leaning over the rail, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are the instrument. I am the player. You go where I tell you to go. Then tell us where you are going, she countered softly, because right now, you are running.
The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. I was running. I was accelerating the tempo not because the music demanded it, but because I was frantic. The tension between us, the memory of her hand under mine on the violin, the way she looked at me, it was driving me out of my mind. I was projecting my own internal chaos onto the orchestra. I was punishing them for the fact that I was falling in love with her, and I didn't know how to stop.
The silence in the room stretched, thin and taut as a wire. They sensed it. The entire orchestra sensed the specific, electric frequency of the tension between us. It wasn't just professional friction anymore. It was personal. It was intimate. We were having a lover's quarrel in a room full of 200 people, fighting about tempo, when we were really fighting about surrender. My hand shook. I dropped the baton. It clattered onto the podium floor, a hollow, wooden sound that signaled the end of my authority. Rehearsal's over, I said, my voice barely audible. I didn't wait for them to pack up. I turned and walked off the stage, my heels striking the floorboards with a rapid, uneven rhythm. I fled to my office, slammed the door, and leaned back against it, gasping for air, shaking with the adrenaline of a disaster I had created entirely on my own. My office had become a cage of polished mahogany and silence. For 4 hours, I had sat in the dark, staring at the glowing face of my watch, watching the seconds tick away the wreckage of the afternoon. The score of the fifth lay closed on my desk, a black monolith I couldn't bear to touch. The shame of my outburst sat heavy in my stomach, a cold, leaden weight that made it hard to breathe. I am not a tyrant. I have never wanted to be the kind of conductor who rules through fear, who breaks spirits to build chords. But today, I had been exactly that. I had looked into the eyes of the one musician who actually understood me, and I had tried to humiliate her because she saw too much. It was past 10 when I finally stood up. The building would be empty now, the musicians long gone to their lives, their lovers, their warm, forgiving homes. I grabbed my coat, intending to slip out the back exit like a thief, avoiding the stage entirely. I didn't want to see the scene of the crime. I didn't want to face the ghost of my own loss of control.
But the hall has a gravity of its own. As I walked down the corridor, the heavy fire door to the stage wings was propped open with a wooden wedge, spilling a sliver of dim, amber light across the linoleum. And then I heard it. Not music, not a melody, just the sound of a bow resting on a string. The faint, scratchy exhale of horsehair against gut. It was a sound of waiting.
I stopped. My hand hovered over the doorframe. I should have kept walking. I should have left her there. But the pull was visceral, a hook in my chest that dragged me through the door and into the shadows of the wings. Charlotte was there. She wasn't playing. She was standing at the edge of the stage, looking out into the empty, cavernous velvet darkness of the auditorium. Her violin hung loose in her right hand, the bow in her left. She didn't look like a subordinate now. In the high contrast shadows of the ghost light, she looked like a statue carved from something harder than marble. She heard my footsteps, the click of my heels on the wooden floorboards, but she didn't turn. She let me walk all the way to the edge of the orchestra pit, let me stand looking up at her from the darkness below, before she finally acknowledged my presence. "I thought you went home," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the rehearsal's tension, but it carried effortlessly in the acoustic perfection of the hall. "I couldn't leave," I admitted. The words felt rough, scraping against the rawness in my throat. I walked closer, resting my hands on the brass railing of the conductor's podium, looking up at her. The angle was wrong. I was used to towering over them. Now she was the giant, and I was the supplicant. "I came to apologize, Charlotte. Today, I lost my composure. I targeted you unfairly. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong." Charlotte turned then, her movement fluid and slow. She looked down at me, her dark eyes catching the glint of the single bulb overhead. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't say, "It's okay." "You were terrified," she said simply. The accuracy of the statement stole the air from my lungs. "I was frustrated," I corrected, trying to salvage a shred of my authority. "The tempo was dragging. The brass was heavy."
"No," she interrupted, her voice dropping to a lower, sultrier register that seemed to vibrate through the railing and into my hands. She stepped to the very lip of the stage, the toes of her boots hovering over the drop. "You weren't frustrated with the brass. You were terrified of the silence. You conduct like you're defending a fortress, maestro. You treat every pause, every breath in the music, like a breach in the wall that you have to patch with mortar and stone."
I gripped the rail tighter. "I am responsible for the structure. If I let it sag, the whole thing collapses."
"That is the fear talking," Charlotte murmured. She crouched down, bringing her face level with mine, though she was still on the stage and I was in the pit. The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. I could smell the rosin dust on her clothes, the warmth of her skin. "You think you're holding up the sky, but you're just blocking the sun. You lead with fear. You drive us because you're scared that if you stop pushing, even for a second, we'll see that you don't know where you're going."
"I know exactly where I am going," I whispered, though my voice shook. "I am trying to survive this legacy. I am trying to be enough for this music." "Then stop fighting it," she said. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, dark and knowing. "You can't control a storm by shouting at the wind. You have to ride it." She stood up slowly, the movement stretching the silence between us until it hummed. She didn't walk away. Instead, she stepped back toward the conductor's stand, the empty podium waiting in the center of the stage. She turned to me, her expression unreadable, challenging, and undeniably inviting. "Come up here," she commanded softly. It wasn't a request. "Come up here. Let me show you what it feels like when you stop building walls and start letting us in."
The wooden steps of the podium had never felt this steep. Usually, I ascended them to command, to stand above the collective noise and wrestle it into order. But tonight, climbing toward her, I felt like I was stepping into a current I couldn't navigate with a baton. Charlotte didn't turn to face me. She remained facing the empty, cavernous dark of the auditorium, her spine straight, her violin raised to her chin in readiness. She was waiting for me to take the lead, not as a conductor, but as something far more tactile. I stepped up behind her. The podium is a small square of real estate, barely enough for one ego, let alone two bodies. I moved into the space she occupied, the heat radiating from her back, hitting me before I even touched her. It was a violation of the invisible electric fence I had built around myself for 20 years. Conductors do not touch musicians. We sculpt the air. We do not sculpt the flesh. But the air between us was already gone.
"Your stance is too rigid," I murmured, my voice low, barely rising above the hum of the ventilation. "You are bracing yourself against the music." I raised my hands. For a second, they hovered over her shoulders, trembling with a hesitation I hadn't felt since my conservatory days. Then I let them land. I placed my palms on the slope of her shoulders, feeling the tension coiled tight in the trapezius muscles. She was holding herself like a suspension bridge in a gale, locked down, unyielding. "Drop them," I commanded softly. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and I felt her structure collapse slightly under my hands. Her shoulders sank. The armor cracked. "Better," I whispered. "You carry the weight of the entire string section right here. You don't have to." I slid my hands down the length of her arms, tracing the line of her triceps to her elbows. Through the thin silk of her rehearsal shirt, her skin was incredibly warm. I wasn't just correcting her posture. I was mapping her. I stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance until the front of my body brushed against her back. It was a shock of contact that made my breath hitch, the solid, grounding reality of her against me. "Lift your right arm," I instructed, guiding her elbow. "You're treating the bow like a weapon. It's a lever. Use the physics, Charlotte. Don't muscle the sound out. Let gravity do the work.
I wrapped my right hand around her forearm, just above the wrist, my fingers overlapping with the leather grip of the bow. My left hand stayed on her waist, fingers splayed over her hip bone, ostensibly to anchor her core, but in reality, to feel the rhythm of her body. The position was intimate, functional, and overwhelmingly distracting. I was the engineer adjusting the machine, but the machine was alive, breathing, and terrifyingly responsive.
Play the open G, I said, my mouth close to her ear. She drew the bow across the string. I moved with her, my hand guiding the speed, adding a heaviness she usually resisted. The sound that emerged was deep, guttural, and rich with a grain that vibrated through the instrument, into her collarbone and straight into my chest. Too fast, I murmured, applying subtle pressure to her wrist to slow the travel of the bow. You're rushing to the resolution. Don't. Stay in the tension. It feels heavy, she whispered, her head tilting back slightly, her hair brushing against my cheek. It's supposed to be heavy, I replied, the words vibrating against the shell of her ear. The adagietto isn't about floating. It's about sinking. It's about the weight of everything you're afraid to say. I pressed closer, my chest flushing against her back, aligning my center of gravity with hers. The professional correction had dissolved into something entirely different. We were a single organism now, fused by the resin and the wood and the terrifying proximity. Breathe here, I commanded, pressing my hand flatter against her stomach to signal the intake. She inhaled sharply, her ribs expanding against my arm. I matched her, my own lungs filling in perfect sync. We held the breath at the top of the phrase, suspended in the dark, before exhaling together as I guided her hand for the downbow. The synchronization was absolute. It was more precise than any beat I had ever given with a baton.
"Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice dropping to a husk. "That is the tempo. It's not a metronome. It's a heartbeat."
Charlotte didn't answer. She just leaned back into me, surrendering the control she fought so hard to keep, letting my hands dictate the surrender she was too terrified to find on her own. The music swelled, filling the empty hall, but I wasn't listening to the acoustics anymore. I was listening to the sound of her breathing, hitching in time with mine. The disaster struck exactly 24 hours before the downbeat. It wasn't a musical failure. The orchestra was finally sounding like the cohesive, breathing beast I had tried to forge. It was the building itself that betrayed us. During the final technical run, a primary winch in the fly system seized with a screech of tearing metal that sounded like a dying animal. A 2-ton lighting truss froze halfway in its descent, dangling precariously over the woodwind section like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Chaos is a smell. It smells like burnt ozone, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, acrid sweat of panicked stagehands. The serenity of my hall was instantly shattered. Men in hard hats were shouting over radios, the fire curtain was being lowered, and the union steward was already screaming about safety violations and overtime. I stood in the center of the maelstrom, clutching a clipboard so hard the plastic snapped in my grip. I was shouting into a phone, barking orders at the facility manager, trying to wrestle the logistics back into submission. But for the first time in my career, my voice wasn't enough. The architecture I worshipped was failing, physically crumbling around me, and I felt the tenuous grip I held on reality slipping with it.
I couldn't breathe. The air in the auditorium was suddenly too thin, too full of dust and noise. I dropped the phone on a tech table and turned on my heel, fleeing not toward the stage, but away from it. I pushed through the heavy double doors into the service corridor, a narrow, concrete artery that ran behind the dressing rooms. It was cold here, lit by the sickly hum of fluorescent tubes, smelling of industrial cleaner and damp concrete. I leaned back against the rough cinder block wall and slid down until I was crouching on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't unclench them. The panic attack hit me like a rogue wave, a sudden, crushing weight on my chest that made my lungs feel like they were filled with wet sand. I gasped, trying to pull in air, but my throat had closed up. The world tilted. The black edges of my vision started to creep in. I was the general music director. I was the woman who terrified the board. And I was currently hyperventilating on a dirty floor in a hallway no one ever visited.
Breathe.
The voice didn't come from inside my head. It came from above me. I looked up, my vision swimming, and saw Charlotte. She wasn't wearing her concert blacks. She was in street clothes, a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, standing over me like a sentinel. She didn't look horrified to see her conductor falling apart. She didn't look pitying. She looked furious, but not at me. She looked furious on my behalf.
I can't, I choked out, the words scraping against my windpipe. The truss, the schedule, it's all... Forget the truss, Charlotte commanded. She didn't offer a hand to pull me up. Instead, she sank down to the floor with me, disregarding the dust on the concrete. She knelt between my spread knees, her presence instantly blocking out the harsh glare of the hallway lights. She filled my field of vision completely. The truss is metal. You are flesh. Look at me. I tried to look away, shame burning hot in my cheeks. I didn't want her to see this. The cracks in the porcelain, the trembling mess behind the podium persona. But Charlotte reached out and took my face in her hands. Her palms were cool, her fingers strong, holding my jaw with a firmness that brooked no argument. Look at me. I forced my eyes to meet hers. They were dark, steady, an anchor in the storm.
I'm a fraud, Charlotte, I whispered, the confession spilling out before I could stop it. It was the poison I had been carrying for 20 years. I can't do this. The Mahler, it's too big. It requires a soul I don't have. I built a career on mechanics because I'm empty. And now the machine is breaking and I have nothing left to hold it up.
Charlotte didn't flinch at the confession. She didn't try to soothe me with lies about how talented I was. She leaned in closer, her thumbs stroking the line of my cheekbones, grounding me in the physical reality of her touch. You are not empty, she said, her voice low and fierce, ringing with the same authority she used to lead the string section. You are just terrified that if you feel it, it will destroy you. But precision isn't about avoiding the crash, Maestro. Isn't that what you told me? Precision is about surviving the impact. She used my own philosophy against me, twisting my words into a lifeline. She moved her hands from my face to my shoulders, gripping hard, shaking me slightly. You demanded I roughen the edges, she said, her eyes locking onto mine. You wanted the grit? This is the grit. This fear, this panic, this is the music. Stop trying to conduct your way out of it and just feel it. My breathing hitched, then slowed. The crushing weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by the solid, undeniable weight of her hands on me. She wasn't letting me spiral. She was holding me in the pocket, forcing me to stay in the tension rather than run from it.
We are going to wait, she stated, her voice dropping to a murmur. We are going to go to your dressing room, and we are going to sit in the quiet until your hands stop shaking. And then you are going to go out there and tell them to cut the truss down if they have to. But you are not going to break.
She stood up then, extending a hand. This time, I took it. She pulled me to my feet, her grip lingering, her thumb brushing over my pulse point, checking the rhythm. The panic hadn't vanished, but it had changed texture. It was no longer a drowning. It was a current I could navigate. Come, she said, turning toward the door. The chaos can wait. You need to breathe. The heavy oak door clicked shut, engaging the magnetic seal that severed us completely from the chaos of the corridor. My dressing room was a vacuum of silence, a space designed to coddle the fragile egos of soloists, insulated by 3 inches of acoustic foam and layers of champagne-colored velvet. The air here was still, smelling faintly of the white lilies wilting on the vanity and the sharp, metallic scent of my own terror. I sank onto the small beige settee, the velvet crushing under my weight, and leaned my head back against the wall. My hands were still vibrating, a low-frequency tremor that seemed to rattle my very bones, a physical echo of the panic that had just brought me to my knees.
Charlotte didn't sit. She locked the door, a decisive metallic snap that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden quiet, and then she turned to watch me. She had become the conductor now, the one holding the invisible baton, the one dictating the energy of the space. She moved closer, entering the circle of my personal space with a terrifying, fluid ease. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of me, close enough that her knees brushed against the fabric of my trousers.
"You're still fighting it," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clinical observation, delivered with the same detached precision she used to tune her A string. "I am trying to regain control," I murmured, closing my eyes to block out the sight of her looming over me. "The Mahler, the Adagietto. It demands too much. It asks for a surrender I have spent 20 years training myself out of. I cannot stand on that podium and bleed, Charlotte. I am an architect, not a martyr."
"It asks for love," Charlotte corrected, her voice dropping an octave. She stepped closer, effectively standing between my knees. It was a position of profound, unspoken intimacy, protective and dominant all at once. I opened my eyes, startled by the intrusion, by the sudden warmth of her body radiating toward mine. She was looking down at me, her expression stripped of all professional distance, her eyes dark and searching. Mahler didn't write that movement as a structure. He sent the manuscript to Alma instead of a letter. It wasn't about load-bearing walls. It was about the terror of being completely, irrevocably known by another person. I looked up at her. The angle made me feel small, vulnerable, a feeling I usually despised but now found myself leaning into, like a weary traveler finding a wall to rest against. "That is why I can't find the pulse," I admitted, the words barely more than a ragged whisper. "I know how to build cathedrals of sound, Charlotte. I know how to engineer a crescendo that brings 2,000 people to their feet, but I do not know how to stand on a podium in front of the world and admit that I am lonely." The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick, like honey pouring slowly from a jar. The dust motes suspended in the vanity lights seemed to freeze.
"I'm afraid," I said, my voice cracking on the last syllable. "I'm afraid of what this means."
I didn't specify what this was. I didn't have to. It was the music. It was the panic. It was the way she was looking at me, seeing through the layers of silk and reputation to the shivering woman underneath. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I didn't want to leave the room. Charlotte didn't offer reassurance. She didn't tell me it would be fine. Instead, she moved. She leaned down, her movements fluid and deliberate. I held my breath, expecting a hand on my shoulder, perhaps a touch to my cheek.
She did neither. She pressed her ear directly against my chest, right over my sternum. The contact was electric. Through the thin, damp silk of my white rehearsal shirt, I could feel the warmth of her face, the curve of her cheekbone pressing firmly into my ribs. It was a shocking, grounding weight. I froze, my hands hovering in the air before slowly, tentatively, coming to rest on her waist. Her hair smelled of rosin and rain, a scent that filled my lungs and dizzied me. She stayed there, listening. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of her breathing. She was listening to the frantic, bird-like hammering of my heart against the cage of my ribs. It was beating a rhythm of pure panic, a presto tempo of fear and desire that no metronome could track. I closed my eyes, feeling the heat of her breath seep through the silk, warming the cold hollow in my chest. The walls I had built, the stone facade of the general music director, the ice queen, the architect, crumbled into dust. There was no podium here, no audience, just the terrifying reality of her weight against me. "Listen," she whispered, her voice vibrating against my breastbone, sending a shiver straight down my spine. "You think this is fear?" She shifted slightly, pressing closer, anchoring me to the settee. "It's not fear," she murmured. "It's life. It's the only rhythm that matters." She stayed there for a long time, counting the beats, letting the erratic hammering slow down. Not into a calm, but into a steady, powerful thud. A rhythm that wasn't mechanical, but organic. "This," she whispered, her breath hitching against my heart. This is the tempo, maestro. Conduct this.
The walk to the podium is usually a march to war, a solitary ascent to a lonely peak. Tonight, it felt like walking into a burning building I had finally decided to stop fighting. The house lights dimmed, plunging 2,000 people into anticipation. But in the darkness, I only saw one person. The silence before the downbeat wasn't the terrifying void I usually feared. It was the pause between heartbeats we had shared in the dressing room, thick with a promise of ruin. I lifted my arms, not to command, but to invite the flood.
When we reached the adagietto, I set the baton down on the velvet stand. The white stick, my symbol of absolute precision, looked small and useless there. I didn't need the stick. I needed the skin. I raised my bare hands, sculpting the heavy, humid air, and looked directly at the first chair. Charlotte met my gaze, her violin raised, the wood glowing under the harsh stage lights. There was no glass wall anymore. She attacked the first note, not with caution, but with a devastating, rich weight that tore the breath from my throat. The tempo was slow, agonizingly slow, but it didn't drag. It pulsed. It was the exact, terrifying rhythm of the blood rushing in my ears when she had pressed her ear to my chest. I didn't conduct the meter. I conducted the ache. I pulled the sound from them, and Charlotte pulled the vulnerability from me. We were locked in a conversation that transcended the score, a private dialogue spoken in C-sharp minor in front of a witnessing crowd. The strings swelled, a tidal wave of sound that broke the rigid architecture I had spent a lifetime defending. For the first time, the ruins were more beautiful than the fortress. I felt the orchestra breathing with me, no longer a machine to be calibrated, but a living thing that bled and wept. When the final note faded into nothingness, suspended in the dust motes, I didn't drop my hands immediately. I held the silence, letting it settle over us like a physical embrace, binding us together in the dark. The applause, when it came, was a physical blow, a roar of approval that felt distant, muffled by the ringing in my blood. I bowed, sweating, exhausted, stripped bare. But when I straightened, my eyes found hers again. She lowered her bow, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. We had survived the impact. The reception was a blur of clinking crystal and suffocating perfume. Donors pressed in, offering compliments that bounced off my armor. Transcendent, they said. A revelation. They didn't know they were praising a collapse. I navigated the room like a ghost, smiling, nodding, gripping a flute of champagne I didn't drink, until I found the exit.
I found her in the corridor leading to the stage door, away from the noise. She was leaning against the wall, her violin case at her feet. She had changed back into her street clothes, the dark coat making her look smaller, yet somehow more substantial than anyone in the ballroom above. The air between us was no longer charged with friction. It was warm, settled, heavy with the aftermath of what we had done.
You didn't use the baton, she noted, her voice low, cutting through the distant hum of the party. I couldn't, I admitted, stopping just inside the radius of her scent. You can't hold a weapon when you're asking for a truce.
She pushed off the wall, closing the distance until the scent of rosin and rain enveloped me again. She didn't touch me, not really. She just brushed a piece of lint from the lapel of my tailcoat, her knuckles grazing the silk over my heart. The contact was brief, searing, a confirmation of the new architecture we had built.
It wasn't a truce, maestro, she murmured, her eyes dark with the memory of the music. It was a partnership.
The hall is empty now. The ghost light stands sentinel on center stage, casting long shadows over the velvet seats. My baton lies on the stand next to her spare bow, 2 instruments of control resting in the quiet. I used to believe that perfection was a wall you built to keep the world out. I know now that true art, and perhaps love, only happens when you let the wall crumble and trust the hands that catch you.
If you've ever found clarity in someone else's rhythm, subscribe for more stories.